The Haunting Murders. A Frank Murray investigation. Narrated by Frank Murray, private investigator. They say every man has his price. Mine's usually a retainer, half up front, and enough coffee to keep my eyes open past midnight. The name's Frank Murray, and I've been working the streets of the city for 15 years. Long enough to know that the interesting cases don't walk through your door very often. Most days, I'm tailing cheating spouses through cheap motels or tracking down someone's prize poodle that decided the neighbor's yard was greener. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. Barely. My office sits above a Chinese restaurant on 4th Street. The smell of Kung Pao chicken has permanently embedded itself into my furniture, and my secretary, well, I can't afford one. It's just me, a battered desk that's seen better decades, and a filing cabinet that sticks every time I try to open it. The neon sign outside flickers Murray Investigations in stuttering red letters. Sometimes M goes out, which I figure is oddly appropriate. I'm not the guy you call when you want flash. I'm the guy you call when everyone else has given up. And brother, I don't give up. It's not nobility or some misplaced sense of justice. It's pure stubbornness mixed with inability to let things go. My ex-wife used to say it was my worst quality. I say it's the only thing that keeps me in business. This particular case started on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays are when Mrs. Chun from downstairs brings up the leftover egg rolls nobody ordered. I was 3 bites into one when Will Mason walked through my door, and I could tell immediately this wasn't going to be about a missing cat. Will was maybe 35, dressed in a wrinkled suit that told me he'd been wearing it for more than a day. His eyes had that hollow look. The kind you get when sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford because grief keeps you awake. His hand shook slightly as he sat down across from my desk, and I pushed a bottle of whiskey toward him. He shook his head. "Mr. Murray," he started, his voice cracking slightly. "My father, Jeff Mason. You knew him, didn't you?" The name hit me like a freight train I should have seen coming. Jeff Mason. Jesus. We'd served together briefly years ago. Different units. But we'd crossed paths in enough bars and bad situations to call each other friends. I'd lost touch with him maybe 5, 6 years back. Life has a way of doing that, pulling people apart like taffy until the connection just snaps. "Jeff's dead," I said, and it wasn't a question. Will nodded, tears forming in his eyes. 3 weeks ago. Police say he fell down the stairs in his new place. Called an accident. Natural causes. But Frank, Mr. Murray, my father, was healthy. He ran marathons. He didn't just fall. I leaned back in my chair, which protested with its usual groan. Tell me everything. What Will told me over the next hour would change everything. Not just for him, not just for Jeff's memory, but for me too. Though I didn't know it yet, this case would drag me through the darkest corners of human greed and obsession, cost me more than I was willing to pay, and nearly end with my own name on a headstone. Jeff's story began 6 months earlier, with a letter from a law firm he'd never heard of. His great-grandfather, a man named Cornelius Mason who'd made his fortune in textiles during the late 1800s, had died intestate years ago, or so everyone thought. But hidden in his estate paperwork was a clause that passed a family mansion to the next male heir once certain conditions were met. Jeff's grandfather had maintained it until his death, and after a legal tangle that took decades to sort out, it finally came to Jeff. The Ashford Mansion sat on 12 acres just outside the city, a Gothic revival monstrosity, complete with turrets, gargoyles, and enough dark windows to make even a skeptic nervous. Jeff had visited it exactly 3 times as a child before his parents had a falling out with his grandfather over something nobody would talk about. Family secrets. They're like termites, eating away at foundations until everything collapses. Dad was excited, Will said, his voice distant with memory, like a kid at Christmas. He kept saying he remembered the library, these huge shelves that went up to the ceiling, and a music room with a piano that played itself. He couldn't wait to get back there. But before Jeff could even pack a box, he got an offer, $2.3 million from an anonymous buyer. No name, no company, just a lawyer's letter and a number that would let most people retire comfortably. Jeff turned it down flat. He said it wasn't about the money, Will explained. He had enough. Comfortable retirement, good investments. He said this was about connection to his history, to the parts of his childhood that felt like magic before everything went dark between the families. So Jeff moved in. The mansion needed work. Decades of minimal maintenance had left it shabby but structurally sound. Jeff threw himself into restoration with the enthusiasm of a man who'd found a purpose. He hired contractors for the big stuff, but did much of the cosmetic work himself. For 2 months, everything was fine. Then the haunting began. It started small. Sounds in the night. Footsteps in empty hallways. Doors closing on their own. Whispers that might have been wind through old pipes. Jeff rationalized it. Old houses settle. They creak. They moan. They have personalities built from decades of existence. But then objects started moving. Jeff would leave his coffee mug on the kitchen counter and find it in the library. Tools would vanish from one room and appear in another. Keys would be on the entry table one moment and in the garden the next day. Still, he tried to explain it away. Stress, fatigue, the mind playing tricks. The smells came next. Perfume, old-fashioned, like roses and powder, would fill a room for 30 seconds and then vanish. Sometimes it was cigar smoke, thick and pungent, though Jeff didn't smoke and allowed no one else to. Then came the smell of burning, acrid and alarming, but with no source, no fire, nothing to explain it. He called me, Will said, his hands gripping his knees. 3 months in, he was rattled, frank. My dad didn't rattle easy, but I could hear it in his voice. He said something was wrong with the house, that maybe the stories were true. Stories. I prompted. The Ashford mansion was supposed to be haunted. Local legend. People said Cornelius's wife went mad there, that she locked herself in a room and was never seen again. They said you could hear her crying on certain nights. Tourist trap nonsense, I thought. Ghost stories to make an old house interesting. But Jeff had started to believe. And then, during a renovation of the south wall in the drawing room, he found something. A wall that sounded hollow. Plaster that seemed newer than the rest, covering something underneath. He'd started to carefully remove it when he realized what was a passageway, sealed up and hidden. He called me the day he found it, Will said, his voice barely above a whisper. Said he'd found something incredible, that I needed to come over, that we'd open it together. He was excited again, like when he first inherited the place. But he also said he'd been seeing things, figures and mirrors that weren't there when he turned around, shadows moving wrong. He laughed it off, said it was probably all the dust and long hours, but Frank, I should have gone right then. I should have dropped everything. But Will had work. He had meetings. He told his father he'd come by that weekend. It was only 4 days away. Jeff Mason didn't make it 4 days. The police found him at the bottom of the main staircase, his neck broken, his body cold. The medical examiner ruled it accidental death. A man in his 60s, probably dizzy from exhaustion and poor eating, lost his footing and fell. No signs of struggle. No evidence of foul play. Case closed. Except Will couldn't close it. And when he came to me, old loyalty stirred in my chest like a sleeping dog finally lifting its head. I'll take the case, I told him. Jeff was a good man. He deserves better than this. Will's eyes filled with tears of relief and grief mixed together. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. I should have told him then that gratitude was premature. I should have warned him that digging into death usually just means finding more graves. But I didn't. I took his retainer check, promised him answers, and watched him leave my office with the first hope he'd felt in weeks. I finished Mrs. Chen's egg roll and stared at the file folder Will had left behind. Jeff's death certificate, police reports, photos of the mansion, and in the back, a single photo of Jeff as a younger man, smiling, with his arm around a woman who must have been his wife, Will's mother. All right, Jeff, I muttered to the empty office. Let's see what really happened to you. The Ashford mansion looked even more imposing in person than in photographs. I drove out the next morning, taking my beat-up Chevy Nova down increasingly rural roads until I hit the long gravel driveway that wound through overgrown gardens to the house itself. The place was a monument to Victorian excess. All dark stone, peaked roofs, and windows that reflected the cloudy sky like dead eyes. The kind of house that made you believe in ghosts even if you didn't want to. I'd dealt with enough reality to be skeptical of the supernatural, but I'd also learned that the scariest monsters are usually human. Well, they'd given me a key. I let myself into the heavy oak front door, which groaned on hinges that probably hadn't been oiled in 50 years. The entry hall was cavernous, with a grand staircase sweeping up to the second floor, the same staircase where Jeff had died. I stood at the bottom and looked up, 15 steps to a landing, then another 15 curving to the right. Hardwood, worn smooth by generations of feet. No loose boards. No obvious hazards. A man could fall here, sure. But a healthy man who ran marathons? That took more than bad luck. I spent the first hour just walking the house, getting a feel for it. The library was as well had described, floor-to-ceiling shelves, most still filled with old books whose spines had faded to illegibility. The music room had a piano, though whether it ever played itself I couldn't say. It was silent now, gathering dust. The drawing room where Jeff had found the passage was on the south side of the house. The wall he'd been working on was obvious, new plaster, tools still scattered on drop cloths, a sledgehammer leaning against a chair. He'd barely started a breakthrough before he died. I picked up the sledgehammer. It was heavy, well-balanced. I tapped the wall where Jeff had marked it, and sure enough, it sounded hollow. Whatever was behind there had been calling to Jeff Mason, and I had a growing suspicion it had killed him for curiosity. But here's the thing about being a decent investigator. You don't trust your suspicions until you can back them up with evidence. So I started looking for it. The sounds Jeff had described could be old house noises, or they could be something else. I walked every hallway, every room, checking for speakers, for devices, for anything that didn't belong. Nothing. I checked the electrical system, ancient knob and tube, wiring that probably should have been condemned. No modern additions I could spot. The moving objects were harder. How do you prove something moved when you weren't there to see it? But I could look for signs of forced entry, for hidden cameras, for anything that suggested someone had accessed the house when Jeff was alone. That's when I found the first one. It was in the library, tucked behind a row of books on a middle shelf. A small black device no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, with a tiny speaker and what looked like a motion sensor. I pulled it out carefully, my heart starting to race. This wasn't antique. This was modern technology, high-end, the kind of thing that costs real money. I spent the next 3 hours searching every room systematically, and I found 6 more devices. Some made sounds, creaking, footsteps, whispers. One seemed to release scent on a timer. Another was rigged to a small motor that could push lightweight objects when activated remotely. Someone had turned the Ashford mansion into a haunted house attraction, with Jeff Mason as the unwitting audience. But why? And who? I photographed everything, documenting position and setup before carefully removing each device. Then I called the one person I knew who could tell me more about them, Miles Danforth. Miles and I went back almost as far as Jeff and I did. He was a genius with electronics, the kind of guy who could build a radio from spare parts and hack into systems that were supposed to be unhackable. He'd helped me on cases before, usually for nothing more than a challenge and whatever I could afford to pay him, which wasn't much. Frank Murray, he answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that perpetual amusement of someone who found the world endlessly entertaining. To what do I owe the pleasure? I need your expertise, I said. Got some devices I need analyzed. Custom work, high-end, need to know who made them. Ooh, mysterious, Miles said. I'll swing by tomorrow. Usual rate. I'll buy you lunch. Sold. Miles arrived the next day in his van, which was less a vehicle and more a mobile electronics lab. He was in his 40s, thin as a rail, with wild gray hair and glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose. He took one look at the devices I collected and let out a low whistle. This is beautiful work, he said, turning one over in his hands. Custom circuit boards, military-grade components, precision engineering. Whoever made these knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't hobbyist stuff. Frank, this is professional. Can you trace them? Miles grinned. Can I trace them? Frank, you wound me. Of course I can trace them. Give me a few days. Those few days nearly killed me with impatience. I went back to mansion, checking and rechecking every room, looking for anything else I might have missed. I examined the staircase again, running my hands along the railing, checking each step for anything loose or tampered with. On the fifth step down from the landing, I found it, a small scratch in the wood that didn't match the general wear pattern. I got down on my hands and knees and looked closer. There, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a tiny hole drilled into the step, and residue that might have been adhesive. Someone had rigged the staircase. They'd placed something here, maybe a tripwire, maybe a slick substance, something that would cause exactly what happened to Jeff. And then they removed it after he fell, leaving only this tiny evidence behind. I photographed it, measured it, documented everything. Then I sat on that staircase and felt a cold rage building in my chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a haunting. This was calculated, premeditated murder. But why? What was worth killing a man over? The answer, I was starting to realize, was behind that wall in the drawing room. Whatever Jeff had found, someone wanted it badly enough to drive him out of the house with fake hauntings. And when that didn't work, they'd killed him for it. I grabbed the sledgehammer. Breaking through the wall took 3 hours and left me covered in plaster dust and sweat. Behind the wall was indeed a passage, narrow and dark, leading deeper into the house's structure. I grabbed a flashlight from my car and stepped inside. The passage was maybe 3 feet wide, the walls bare brick, the floor rough concrete that had been poured decades ago. It went straight for about 20 feet before turning right. At the end of that turn was a door, heavy wood, with an old brass handle. My hand shook slightly as I reached for it. This is what Jeff had found. This is what he'd been excited about. This is what had gotten him killed. The door opened with a groan that echoed in the enclosed space. Beyond it was a room, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with no windows and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. I pulled the chain, and dim yellow light filled the space. The room was packed with shelves, and the shelves were packed with items. But not gold, not jewels, not cash or silver or any of the treasure you'd expect from a hidden room in a mansion. Instead, there were toys. Hundreds of them. Dolls in pristine boxes. Toy trains still in their original packaging. Board games from the 1950s and 60s. Action figures from the 70s and 80s. There were birthday cards, anniversary cards, Christmas ornaments still wrapped in tissue paper. There were photos in frames, never hung. There were letters, sealed in envelopes, addressed but never sent. Each item had a tag. For Jeffrey, age 5, birthday 1967. For Jeffrey, Christmas 1970. For Jeffrey and Mary, anniversary 1995. I stood in that room and felt something break inside my chest. This wasn't treasure. This was love. This was decades of man buying gifts for family members he'd been estranged from, hoping that one day the rift would heal and he could give them. Hope preserved in cardboard and cellophane. Cornelius Mason had been a stubborn old bastard, too proud to reconcile while he lived, but too loving to give up entirely. So he created this room, this time capsule of intention and regret. And someone had killed Jeff Mason for it. I took photos of everything, documenting the room carefully. Then I called Will. I found what your father discovered. I told him, you need to see this. Will arrived 2 hours later. I led him through the passage to the room and watched as the same realization I'd had washed over his face. He picked up a package labeled, for Jeffrey, age 8, Christmas 1973, and started crying. He remembered. Will whispered. Great-granddad remembered, even after they stopped speaking. We spent an hour in that room, looking at decades of preserved intention. As it turned out, Cornelius hadn't even done all of this himself. His will had included a secret codicil unknown to the family, instructing his executor to continue the tradition after his death. The executor had faithfully done so for another 30 years before his own death, at which point he'd had the passage sealed, protecting the contents until they could be discovered by the intended recipient. These are worth a fortune, Will said quietly, holding a pristine Star Wars action figure still in its package. Collectors would pay tens of thousands for some of these, maybe more. 7 figures worth, easily, not gold and jewels, but still a treasure. One built on love and nostalgia rather than greed, and one that Dick Mansford had killed for. Miles called me that evening with the name. The devices have been built by a private security company that specialized in psychological operations. They created scenarios for military training, haunted house attractions, and apparently custom jobs for private clients. With the right pressure, and I knew how to apply pressure, the owner gave up the client's name. Richard Dick Mansford, local businessman, real estate developer, grew up in the area, and crucially, had tried to buy the Ashford mansion for $2.3 million right after Jeff inherited it. I did some digging. Mansford was in his 50s, successful but not spectacularly so. He owned several properties in the region, had a reputation as a sharp negotiator, and according to local gossip, had been obsessed with the Ashford mansion since he was a kid. The old stories about treasure, the rumors of a hidden room. Mansford had grown up on those tales, and had spent decades trying to figure out how to acquire property. When Cornelius died and the inheritance went to Jeff, Mansford saw his chance. First, he tried to buy it. When that failed, he decided to haunt Jeff out. The devices, the staged supernatural events, all designed to make Jeff so uncomfortable he'd sell for any price. And when even that didn't work, when Jeff discovered the passage and was close to finding the room, Mansford escalated to murder. I had the devices. I had the motive. I had the connection. What I didn't have was proof that Mansford had rigged the staircase or been in the house the night Jeff died. So I set a trap. I called Mansford's office and left a message. Told him I was a private investigator, that I'd been hired by the Mason family, and that I found some interesting devices in the Ashford mansion. I said I was willing to discuss the matter privately before involving the police. Then I gave him an address, an empty warehouse I'd used before for meetings that needed to stay off the books. He showed up. That alone told me volumes. An innocent man would have called a lawyer. Mansford came alone. He was tall, well-dressed, with the kind of smile that's salesman perfect, warm and completely empty. We met in the middle of the warehouse floor, just us and the echo of our footsteps. "Mr. Murray," he said, extending his hand. I didn't shake it. "I understand you wanted to discuss something." "Jeff Mason," I said simply. Something flickered in his eyes. "Fear, maybe, or calculation. Terrible accident. I heard about it. I'd offered to buy his property, you know. Shame we never came to terms." "Yeah," I said. "Shame. Except it wasn't an accident. It was murder. And you did it." Mansford laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's quite an accusation. I hope you have proof. I have the devices you planted in the house. I have your connection to the company that made them. I have your motive. You wanted what was in that hidden room. You thought it was treasure. Gold, jewels, cash. You'd heard the stories your whole life, and you convinced yourself they were true. Stories," Mansford said dismissively. "Children's tales." "Maybe," I said, "except you believed them enough to kill for them. You haunted Jeff, tried to drive him out. When he found the passage, you panicked. So you rigged his staircase and pushed him when he came to investigate another of your fake supernatural events. One shove. That's all it took. And then you removed the evidence and walked away." Mansford's smile had vanished. "You can't prove any of that. I can prove the devices. I can prove you paid for them. I can prove you were obsessed with that house. Maybe that's not enough for a conviction, but it's enough to start a real investigation. Enough to get search warrants for your property, your finances, your communications. And Dick, something tells me that when the police start looking, they're going to find what I couldn't. Maybe receipts. Maybe video. Maybe witness statements from your employees who helped you. Rich guys like you always make mistakes. You think you're too smart to get caught, so you get sloppy. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then Mansford did something I didn't expect. He laughed. Really laughed. Doubling over with it. "Treasure," he gasped out between laughs. "You know what was in that room? Toys. Birthday presents. Sentimental garbage. Decades of it, sure, and worth money to collectors. But not the fortune I'd imagined. Not the gold and jewels and cash. Just toys." "You killed a man for toys," I said, my voice flat. "I killed a man for nothing," Mansford said, and his laughter turned bitter. "I spent 30 years obsessing over that house. 30 years planning. And for what? For some old man's guilt preserved in action figures and board games? It's almost funny. Almost. Jeff Mason is dead, I said. His son is destroyed. There's nothing funny about it. Mansford's face hardened. Then maybe you should have stayed out of it, Murray. He moved fast for a man his age. The gun came out of his jacket in a smooth motion, pointed straight at my chest. I'd half expected it. Desperate men do desperate things, but it still sent adrenaline spiking through my system. Here's how this works, Mansford said, his voice suddenly cold and businesslike. You had an accident, investigating a dangerous warehouse. You fell. Tragic. The PI business is so risky. You think killing me makes us go away? I asked, hands raised, mind racing. I've got copies of everything. My friend Miles has copies. Well, Mason has copies. You shoot me, and all you do is add another murder to your list. Maybe, Mansford said, but at least I'll have the satisfaction. The thing about desperate men with guns is their focus on the threat in front of them. They forget about the threats they can't see. The warehouse door burst open, and police flooded in, guns drawn. Dropped the weapon. Mansford's face went through about 5 different emotions in 2 seconds. Surprise, rage, fear, and finally resignation. The gun clattered to the concrete floor. I'd called Detective Sarah Chun before I'd come to the meeting, given her copies of everything I'd found. She'd been skeptical, but willing to follow my lead. And Mansford's confession, caught on the wire I was wearing, sealed it. Richard Mansford, Detective Chin said, approaching with handcuffs ready. You're under arrest for the murder of Jeffrey Mason. As they led him away, Mansford looked back at me. I wasted my life on a fantasy, he said quietly. 30 years, chasing a dream that was never real. You wasted your life killing a good man. I corrected. There's a difference. The trial took 6 months. Mansford's lawyers tried everything. Argued the confession was coerced, that the evidence was circumstantial, that Jeff's death really was an accident, and the haunting devices were just a weird coincidence. But Miles's forensic analysis of the staircase, combined with Mansford's confession on tape, was too much to overcome. He got life without parole. I testified for 3 days, walking the jury through every piece of evidence, every connection, every device. Will sat in the gallery every day, watching justice slowly grind toward his father. When the verdict came in, he found me outside the courthouse. We didn't say anything, just shook hands. 2 men who'd done right by someone they loved. The contents of the secret room went to Will as part of Jeff's estate. He sold some of it, the really valuable collectibles that meant nothing personally, and donated the money to children's charities in his father's name. The rest he kept, all those preserved gifts from a great-grandfather who'd loved his family even across a chasm of pride and silence. The Ashford mansion sits empty now. Will couldn't bring himself to live there after what happened, and I don't blame him. Some places hold too much sadness to ever feel like home. He's thinking about turning it into a museum, a place to tell Cornelius's story and Jeff's, and to remind people that love and greed are both powerful motivators, but only one of them is worth dying for. As for me, I went back to my office above the Chinese restaurant, back to the flickering neon sign, and the desk that's seen better days. The case paid, well, Will insisted on a bonus when it was over. So I upgraded my coffee maker and finally fixed that filing cabinet. But I think about Jeff sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet and my office is dark, except for the streetlight coming through the window. I think about how he died excited about discovering his family's history, never knowing that history was about to kill him. I think about Mansford, rotting in prison, driven insane by the realization that he'd wasted his life chasing fool's gold. Mostly, though, I think about that room, all those wrapped presents, waiting for their intended recipients. All that hope and love preserved in cardboard and cellophane, hidden behind a wall, kept safe for the day when the family might heal. Jeff found it, in a way. The family did heal, just not the way Cornelius had hoped. Will knows now that he came from people who loved deeply, even when they loved badly, and maybe that's its own kind of treasure. Me? I'm back to cheating spouses and missing pets. But every now and then, a case comes along that reminds me why I do this job. Why I keep grinding away in this crappy office with smell of Kung Pao chicken and its broken furniture. Because somebody has to stand up for the Jeff Masons of the world. The good people who get caught in the crossfire of other people's greed and obsession. And when I can bring their killers to justice, when I can give their families some small measure of peace, well, that's worth more than any treasure hidden behind a wall. The name's Frank Murray. I'm a private investigator. I'm not rich, I'm not famous, and most of my cases aren't interesting, but I get the job done. And sometimes that's enough. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications of other tales from Frank Murray's case files. There are more mysteries to solve, more crimes to uncover, and more stories to tell. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next case.